Bill Clinton, and here's a mistake, a tragedy. Bill Clinton could have captured that constituency had he chosen, of just a few things. Certainly not, NAFTA and a few other trade issues, but he didn't. He didn't, and that Perot constituency, which had a kind of rough character to it. By the way, as strong in the North as it was in the South, Clinton failed to capture that, which meant that by the time he got to the year 2000, the country was divided, equally. And I think you see in places like northern Maine and certain areas of the rural Midwest where Perot was very strong, and those areas have gone over to the Republicans.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig. The presidency of Bill Clinton is often remembered for economic prosperity, political centrism, and an ability to bridge the gap between left and right. And, well, the whole cigar thing. But as time passes, I think it's fair to say that the maybe devastating ramifications of the Clinton presidency are becoming clearer. Beneath the surface, Clinton's embrace of neoliberalism, corporate-friendly policies, and a calculated retreat from progressive ideals may have had far-reaching consequences, ones that we're reckoning with today, maybe even explain today, this Trump era. By sidelining labor, gutting social safety nets, and championing policies like welfare reform and financial deregulation, Clinton reshaped the Democratic Party into a technocratic, market-driven institution, one that abandoned its New Deal roots in favor of triangulation and political survival. As we are experiencing an era of democratic backsliding in the United States, it's crucial to ask, did Clinton's failures in progressive governance create the conditions that led to the rise of Donald Trump? Did the disillusionment of working-class voters, the erosion of economic security, and the retreat from bold leftist policies open the door for right-wing populism? In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Nelson Lichtenstein, professor of history at University of California, Santa Barbara, and co-author of the book A Fabulous Failure: The Clinton Presidency and the Transformation of American Capitalism. We discuss how the Clinton presidency weakened progressive governance, the long-term damage it inflicted on the Democratic Party, maybe American democracy itself, and how it helped lay the foundation for the political crisis, this grievance-driven, score-settling Trump era we're living through today. All right, if you like this episode or any episode, please give it a like, share, and follow on your favorite podcast platform, and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Dr. Lichtenstein, thanks for being here. How are you?
Delighted to be here. I'm fine.
Okay, I'm glad to hear it. So over the past few years, I've been thinking about how we got to the present moment we're in our politics, which to me seems like it short-circuited somewhere between Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. It really seemed like we were on some type of a trajectory that wasn't overwhelmingly progressive, but it did seem like that was the general direction we were kind of stumbling into. It didn't feel well-directed, but it felt like it was happening. So, where we are now, 10 years ago would have seemed, I don't think it's unreasonable to say utterly impossible, yet here we are. And I think a knee-jerk reaction would be to blame figures like George W. Bush or Mitch McConnell or Donald Trump, et cetera. And I think that's probably fair, but I've also been thinking more and more about the failures, if that's the right word, of quote-unquote liberal figures like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. And you've written extensively about this, especially Clinton. So I'm excited to get your take on this.
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, there's the immediate events involving the return of Trump and Trumpism in general. I think we'll be labeling these last 12 years, assuming he completes his presidency is the age of Trump, although Biden, is there. But anyway, I think so. There's the immediate aspects of that, and you can look at, as you mentioned, various politicians and decisions that have been made. But in general, I think pundits and historians and just everyone in general thinks, there's something went wrong. Something definitely went wrong within the world of within America and within the body of liberalism, and that's stretching back. Actually, you can go back to Carter, but Clinton. You're right, Bill Clinton and Obama. Despite what I do think were some genuinely liberal, progressive, actually not anti-capitalist, but efforts to manage capitalism, which both of those individuals and some people around them had. Nevertheless, we do label them, and I think probably correctly, as a part of what we'd call a neoliberal sort of statecraft from the 90s, and including Barack Obama's response to the big economic crisis of the 2008. Now, this word neoliberal, by the way, of course, is become a kind of cliche and a kind of encompasses too much, but nevertheless, when we think about it, let's crudely just say a kind of belief in international trade, the market above that of managing capitalism domestically, and a kind of somewhat austere social programs. Now, the main point I would make, and I've tried to make in this book that I wrote on the presidency of Bill Clinton, is that it would be a mistake to think of this strand of statecraft, of neoliberal statecraft, as a kind of pure ideology that individuals like Bill Clinton, walk into the White House with, or Barack Obama, for that matter, or any other politician. That was not the case at all. And in fact, I think what's the creative tension and what we can learn from the experience of, say, a Clinton or an Obama, is that their commitment during the campaign and their whole life, really, to a sort of more progressive, liberal, pro working class, a kind of democratic politics that they had. That's one reason they were elected. Certainly, Clinton, his campaign in 1992 was one which was the economy stupid. What that meant was let's get back to fundamentals. Let's end the stagnation of living standards. But the tension there is that despite all of these intentions and people he brought in who agreed with him, nevertheless, social forces, ideological forces, political upheavals, a whole variety of circumstances, some self-inflicted, some from without, pushed Clinton to where he ended up in the end of his presidency as what we think of today as kind of this neoliberal presidency, which in effect, as Bernie Sanders put it in a very recent post, the Democrats abandoned the working class. But the point of it is that I think we have to look at why it is that sort of good intentions, progressive intentions, were thwarted and sort of turned inside out. I think that's the point that we can learn from these presidencies. Okay.
I don't want to put too fine a point on it because I think you touched on this, but I think it's worth digging a little bit into if we're looking at where Clinton and Obama specifically landed as it relates to kind of their approach to globalization and free trade. And maybe we encapsulate that in some type of neoliberal ideology. I think, it's worth maybe, I guess, putting a finer point on this idea that I think we look back and think that presidents come into office and have a very specific ideology that then they layer over global events and they layer over domestic events and they layer over, the politics of the day. But in reading some of your work and just kind of reflecting on both Clinton and Obama, it feels more to me that's giving them maybe a little bit too much credit, and that instead these might just have been two figures that obviously had influential figures behind them. For Clinton, it was like Rubin and Summers and Reich, but that they were kind of iterating in the moment, the end of the Cold War, the end of history, the rise of globalization, the internal politics at home were very conflictual, and that they were maybe in the moment evolving and adjusting to that, and that ended up creating an ideology in retrospect.
Well, right. I mean, I think there's a level of opportunism or just kind of a political happenstance that takes place. Obviously, I think I think there were some elements that were wrong, and while they thought, I believe, and I emphasize to the Clinton's healthcare reform, which he saw not just as a good thing for expanding the welfare state, but also as industrial policy, because one of the reasons that American industry was having difficulty competing in those days with Germany and Japan was because of the burden of healthcare costs. It costs more money for healthcare than steel, said the president of the Ford Motor Company. This is something that comes out of the economics. It was essentially a benign, and that it could not have the kind of devastating impact it had on specific communities, particularly in the Rust Belt. And I think they underplayed that. And then of course trade was not just about trade; it was also about immigration, and this was clearly the case with NAFTA. I mean, Clinton himself was not didn't walk into the White House as a NAFTA warrior. We have to pass that. That was not an important part of his campaign or of his outlook. It was actually a NAFTA, the trade agreement with Mexico, was pushed forward both by the Mexican government and by the H.W. Bush administration. But Clinton, I think, I call it a blunder in pushing that forward, and it had very, very deleterious consequences in terms of his electoral base and what we think of as his trade regime. Of course, the opening to China was actually far more devastating when it came to the industrial base of the country than Mexico. But your point is right that there's always a mixture of kind of pre-existing ideas which are there, and then the events and rapid fire events of a moment that push people in one direction or another. But I do think that it is important that the underlying circumstances of the early 1990s were that liberals, progressives, the labor movement, people of that sort, were worried about the rise of Germany and Japan as both different models of capitalism, more successful models of capitalism, and then of course also trading threats to the United States. The end of the Cold War, took all of that sort of foreign policy oriented, conversation, discourse, which had dominated American politics for decades, was sort of over, and we moved on to a new set of problems. As Senator Tsongas, who was a rival of Kennedy, of Obama for the presidential nomination in 1992, put it, he said, the Cold War is over, Germany and Japan have won. And that was something, a sentiment that Clinton was also concerned with. And so that's why both in terms of his domestic policies initially, and even to some degree trade policies, everyone's forgotten the very determined effort that the Clinton people made to manage trade with Japan, to force the Japanese to buy American products and restrict the kind of dumping of goods in the United States. This was a big effort, and it failed. But it indicates that Clinton, again, didn't walk into the White House as a neoliberal. He ended up that way, I think, and it's probably criticized, but that was not where he came from. And I repeat, it's important for liberals, progressives, to understand that it's not just a question of sheer ideology. It's a question of what your policies are, what coalitions you create, and how you conduct your statecraft to understand whether you're going to succeed or fail and move in a liberal or conservative direction.
You make this point, and I think we're thinking more about this just generally in at least the political arena, the evolution of or the impact of policies under Clinton and I suppose Obama and how they have contributed to what some might consider to be the morass we're in right now.
Mm.
And I think we tend to look at, if we can just look at the moment we're in now, there's a narrative around Trump and his policies that it's chaos and that it's unintelligent or unintelligible and that it's potentially dangerous. But if we take a longer view, and I'm not trying to I'm not trying to justify this, but I think if we take the longer view, and maybe you would disagree, but a lot of the grievance that Trump tapped into comes directly out of some of the policies under Clinton and I suppose under Obama as well. And Trump's policies as it relates to globalization and then free trade and trade deals in a way would almost seem like very strategically targeted. And outside of the politics of it, I do wonder if there is a certain amount of intelligence to it that I don't want to ascribe to Trump. Maybe it's a knee-jerk, just instinctual in him. But I wonder if you think this is Trump tapping into something a bit more political, a grievance that came out of, these policies, or if he's actually tapping into something that is a necessity as it relates to American policy in these areas.
I don't disagree at all. I mean, I clearly that's the case. Trump's tariff sort of fixation. He does it very crudely and probably have a kind of certain kinds of backlash, but nevertheless, it does reflect the opposition to certain of these free trade deals. Let me just make a point about trade for a second. Then I want to say something else about Trump as well. The reason that all economists, actually even today, almost are in favor of free trade, and this extends over to the left as well, is that it is true that a free trade regime does have the effect of kind of in a utilitarian way lowering the price of goods that millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of consumers purchase in various ways, from cars to what you buy at Walmart. It does lower it. They're more efficient producing it in China or Mexico. However, to the degree that hundreds of millions of people may save a dollar here or a dollar there on their T-shirt or even their imported car more than a few dollars, trade has a very, very pointed and devastating impact on particular industries, particular communities, and those have a very large political resonance. And that's something that the left has to deal with, and liberals have to deal with, and something that Trump, of course, has pointed out. Now, I want to make one thing that we do have to just with Trump say this. Yes, he's picked up on these economic grievances, and they are not just again with the white working class, but with black and brown and others as well. But clearly, with Trump, there's also this sort of white Christian nationalist strand. It's related, of course, to the economic difficulties, but it's not sort of a one-to-one relationship. It can't be quite mechanically connected. But he clearly has picked up on that, and I think that really is the core of his appeal. And I don't think we should just to be sort of economic fundamentalists on this question. That's there,
Well, and I'm glad you bring this up, because I think we always look for easy answers or easy explanations for things that have happened or where we are or what's happening. And I think an easy answer would be to look at Clinton and say there was some sharp pivot under Clinton and a failure on Clinton's part that contributed to the moment that we're in today, which may be true. But I think the mistake made in that is to assume that all of the voters that made up the Democratic coalition in the 80s and 90s then somehow have pivoted to become the hard right, far right, conservative Trump voters now.
Of course not. Right, obviously, and by the way, the Democratic coalition, kind of held together to a degree all through the Obama years, and you can trace that out in polling. I would say this: the one thing that a very good economic historian Gavin Wright made the point that NAFTA was this very, we remember it now. It's not as important as China, but we remember it very well because of its politically toxic character. And with what would happen with NAFTA was that its impact actually politically was greater in the South than in the industrial North. It was in the South that there were lots and lots of sort of rural apparel factories and parts factories, things that could be easily moved to Mexico, and they were. And so the Democrats, who had been still winning congressional elections in the South up through the early 90s, it was in the 1994 election that they're wiped out in the South. And that's when the Republican Party really comes to dominate the South in a definitive way. And all those they're called blue dog Democrats, moderate Democrats, they're wiped out by, and NAFTA is one of the major reasons that happens in 1994. And from that point on, we have at least the conservative coalition gets a major bulwark. I would make one other point, by the way. Another figure that we have not mentioned today is Ross Perot. And Ross Perot won 19% of the presidential vote in 1992, and I think about 9% in 1996. And Perot was not a right-wing culture warrior. He had some right-wing background, when it came to Vietnam and things of that sort. But he was also emphasizing a kind of hostility to trade, to NAFTA in particular, and also a kind of industrial policy, a kind of let's focus on at home. And that constituency, Bill Clinton, and here's a mistake, a tragedy. Bill Clinton could have captured that constituency had he chosen, of just a few things, certainly not NAFTA and a few other trade issues, but he didn't. And that Perot constituency, which had a kind of rough character to it, by the way, as strong in the North as it was in the South, Clinton failed to capture that, which meant that by the time he got to the year 2000, the country was divided, equally. And I think you see in places like northern Maine and certain areas of the rural Midwest where Perot was very strong, and those areas have gone over to the Republicans. So that was a kind of, I would just make this point about Clinton. Clinton was a terrible leader of the Democratic Party. He was terrible. And Obama was in his own way, but certainly on many trade deals and on welfare issues, he was winning those issues with Republican votes, not Democratic votes in the Congress. And so he really he got himself reelected, true, but the Democrats were harmed by Clinton's presidency.
I want to swing back and talk about this last point in a few minutes, the coalitions that Clinton built and how that potentially undermined progressive causes. But before we get there, I'm glad you bring up Ross Perot, because I think history is looking at him a little bit differently, or the impact that he has. And I actually think if we cast a wider net and look even further back, I think we do ourselves a disservice as, at least in the political and governing realms, to dismiss third-party candidates and the support or the type of support that they're tapping into. And I think Perot was a character and a figure that captured such a significant slice of the electorate. And as you mentioned, Clinton did a terrible job of reaching out to that electorate. And by extension, I suppose the Democrats did. But I wonder if within their own house, the Democrats then made the same mistake in 2016 with Bernie Sanders, dismissing whatever it is that he was tapping into that kind of played out. There were different factors that played into the 2020 election, but might have the impact of that ignorance on the part of Democrats in 2016 may have played out in this last election.
Yeah, right. Yes. I mean, they're clearly, if you get down to the sort of inside, Beltway politics, I mean, Hillary Clinton was very hostile to Bernie. There was no effort to create a kind of coalition, a kind of, he dismissed him. And that was clearly a mistake. and there were, we've political scientists have shown lots of Sanders supporters ended up voting for Trump. There was that kind of I don't know, pitchfork hostility to the reigning establishment, and Hillary Clinton, who'd been in politics for now 30 years, represented that. Biden, of course, was smart. In the spring of the year 2020, he reached out to Bernie and his supporters, and there was a kind of a coalition that ran and won in 2020. I also think, by the way, just that the Black Lives Matter phenomena was very helpful to Biden, even though he didn't identify with it, but it energized millions of people who got them interested in politics, and I think that had a big impact later on. And then, of course, we could look at 2024, and I think you can see that again. Sanders doesn't run, so his base is not energized, and for whatever her clearly Harris was. I mean, she wasn't overtly hostile to it, but that wasn't something she emphasized, and it's kind of interesting that the Sanders people and AOC, etc., they were the last ones to abandon Biden. They were for Biden, because there was this sort of coalition that Biden had built with them, and they were reluctant to abandon it. But yeah, I mean, Hillary was identified with the sins of her husband, and especially there were two other events, two other policy things in the Clinton period that made for upper middle class liberals particularly hostile or pissed off Clinton, and that was the crime bill of 1994 and the welfare reform of 1996. And I mean, those two, they have it's interesting history of them and what's happened subsequently, but they were issues that were particularly seemed to indicate Clinton's betrayal of post-civil rights, progressive values, and he was, too clever by half in seeking to, win re-election, and he made tremendous enemies among a certain strata of I would say middle class kind of talking class kind of people, and they've never forgiven Bill Clinton for that, and Hillary was tarred with it.
I want to actually talk a bit more about this. You mentioned this in your last response and one prior about this coalition, or the coalitions that Clinton built to, at the time when he left office, he was considered to have been a very successful president, or it was a very successful presidency, at least economically, I suppose. But really what was happening underneath, and you've touched on this, is that Clinton was building coalitions primarily across the aisle. So he was working primarily with conservatives because he just couldn't get the ball across the line with just the Democratic coalition. Right. And I think what happened there is that he actually ended up, in retrospect, cracking the coalition. Mm. So you end up with, and this is just a broad brush, but you end up with true progressives that are pissed off, as you said, right? And then they're kind of cleaved away from what might be considered blue dogs or more moderate Democrats. That I think this is how I see it, and you can tell me if this is a bad characterization. He made those both parties in that coalition essentially politically homeless and weakened. So the blue dogs, or the moderates, then became, I think, to some degree over time, easy pickings for the Republican Party. And it was difficult to cobble together that coalition in 2016 in the same way, especially with Hillary Clinton and the baggage that she was bringing from the Bill Clinton presidency.
Yeah, he did. Yes. One thing that maybe we learned from Trump is it's really important to cultivate your base. That's more important than even reaching out. And Clinton did not cultivate his base. I guess a conventional view at colleagues, let's reach out, fight for the middle ground, et cetera. But I'm not sure that's entirely true. And the mobilization of your base is more important. And Clinton does not do that. The 1996 election, for example, the turnout was one of the worst in American history. 1992 was much better. I would say, let me say about his yes, there's the coalition building. Clinton did think, and I think rightly, that there was a slice of American capital that would support his economic policies, that especially his, initially stimulus policies and healthcare policies and policies that would again, make the American version of capitalism be more competitive and more successful in this early period. And so that was, and he did, in December of 1992, had a big economic conference in Little Rock, and it was full of CEOs, and they were there not because Clinton was promising to cut taxes or deregulate. Quite the opposite. It was because Clinton was promising to policies that would sustain and revive American industry. The other wing of capital that Clinton is linked to is symbolized by Robert Rubin, who is from Goldman Sachs, and Rubin. And there was an element of this was true of Wall Street. It's still true, actually. He was a welfare state liberal. That is, Rubin was, he came out of a family that had been left Democratic for generations. His mother was a civil rights activist and voted for Henry Wallace in 1948. And Rubin was had supported McGovern and raised money for him. But Rubin was in favor of various kinds of moderate welfare state policies and made him sort of popular in that period. But what Rubin was also in favor absolutely of was the absolute mobility of capital. What that means free trade, but it also means mergers and acquisitions and the capacity of Wall Street to roam the world and invest and disinvest where it chose to do so. That he thought was the essence of kind of a liberal world. And he thought, I think ideologically, I think that here the Wall Streeters were mistaken and the liberals who went along with them, that this would ultimately produce a kind of worldwide civil society. If you're going to have a stock market in China or Russia, well, then you're going to have a financial press that has to be free to report on what's going on. And from there, you just move step by step into kind of, at least if not liberal democracy, at least a kind of civil society. Well, they were wrong about that, but that was something that Rubin thought, very strongly. And he also thought that, that low interest rates were a key to revival. He was not enamored of the industrial policy ideas, which mean sort of targeted investments that Clinton liked initially. And so a big fight in the early Clinton moment, the first year really, is are we going to move toward a balanced budget? The point of which was not balancing the budget per se, but it was getting interest rates down among the bond traders of Frankfurt and London and New York and Tokyo. And Rubin was determined to do that. He thought that was the key to economic revival. I think that was mistaken, but he was a very, I say in the book and that Rubin is unquestionably the second most important figure in the Clinton administration, and in some cases, the most important.
So if we talk about Rubin, and then I suppose if we bundle him with Summers and Reich and their approach to global economy as well as, I suppose, domestic economy, and I hate to use this phrase, but the trickle-down impacts that's supposed to have on kind of working class voters, which made up at the time a significant chunk of the Democratic Party's base. But we've seen that that part of the base has shifted. And this is notwithstanding as you mentioned, the Christian nationalism that is also making up part of that base. But how much do you ascribe to Rubin and Summers and Reich, their approach to that shift of those voters away from the Democratic Party and the situation that we're in today?
Well, of course, insofar as they were quite willing to allow the hollowing out of American industry and the communities dependent upon it. I mean, that creates a sort of social dynamite or tinder that can be taken advantage of by the right, and that is the usual today liberal view of this, and I think it's true. I mean, I think that's why Biden was so determined to with his infrastructure plans and CHIPS plans to reindustrialize the Midwest and the Middle South. I think that's absolutely the case, and I mean, Summers is even more of a kind of cheerleader for international capital than even Rubin was. Reich is a little bit different. While Reich was a free trader, he had fights with others on the liberal side of the administration on that question. Reich is a free trader. He was also very much in favor of domestic stimulus plans, about regulating industry, and he clashed with Robert Rubin and Summers on this question. So did Joseph Stiglitz, who's also a figure in the Clinton administration, head of the Council of Economic Advisors, who also clashes repeatedly with Rubin and Summers. I mean, they become absolutely enemies of the most intense sort. Reich, of course, has moved to the left considerably since then, but at that moment in the early 1990s, he's a kind of he has this series of essays, well, sort of, if you build it, they will come. Mm-hmm. If you educate the American worker, make them more skilled, provide some infrastructure, and so kind of some R&D, etc. Well, then it doesn't matter whether the company is owned by the Japanese or the Germans or whoever it is. They'll build factories in America anyway, and we can sort of, if you build it, they will come. I mean, I think that's fundamentally wrong in terms of kind of industrial economics, but that was the view that Reich had, which led him to support NAFTA, while at the same time being very much in favor of all sorts of domestic initiatives, the more progressive that Clinton had.
This is a bit of an aside, but as long as we're talking about Reich, he's kind of all over the place right now. And like you said, he's writing a series of essays. And, people have the ability to reinvent themselves. But I have to tell you, with this lens that we see the Clinton presidency, Clinton policies, and how they've played out over the past handful of decades, and the potential contribution that has been to our current politics, it's really hard to look at Reich now and take anything that he says seriously, or at least without a caveat of, well, dude, you might be part of the reason.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, no, although I do think, I think he's proven his bona fides over the last 20 years. He has been for 20 years. He's been more than that, actually. He has been on the left, mm-hmm. At least, in his public presentation. He actually wrote this book, Locked in the Cabinet, which is he published it in 1997 or 8. It was a pretty bitter book, actually, critical of Clinton. I make this point, which I think does reflect the progressive politics in this era. The period from the 70s and 80s and early 90s was the worst period for the American labor movement in the 20th century. It's certainly in terms of its appeal to other sectors of society. It was losing members and losing clout. But even more, it was the worst period ideologically, and in terms of its sort of general sort of social outlook and its attractiveness. In the 20th century, had been the last supporter of the Cold War. It really ignored the new social formations arising in the working class, and people like Reich and Bill Clinton were reciprocated with kind of disdain, and this is not a player. So I think that's, as I said, that's sort of a hand that didn't clap, a dog that didn't bark, an absence from the body politic. Which today the labor movement is actually still very weak in terms of numbers, but ideologically, culturally, it has more kind of salience. I have to say, I was part of a movement in the mid 90s when Sweeney came in and took over the movement to sort of link up sort of left wing academics and radical activists with the labor movement again. I think that has happened to some degree. So I think that's important. Reich's and people like Reich, who were sort of they really were trying to construct a liberalism without a full hand. You can't construct a liberalism without the labor movement, at least the idea of a labor movement, and they were trying to do that, and that was something that was beyond Bill Clinton's ken. He couldn't snap his fingers and create a labor movement, but it wasn't there. It was in numbers stronger than it is today, but ideologically and culturally, it was at its most retrobate and unattractive to liberals anyway during the whole 20th century. And I think that's something that it wasn't Clinton's fault, but it was one reason that he could drift to the right so easily. And a labor movement that exists and that is vocal and is and has the potential for growing, I think that helps discipline the Democratic Party, at least to a degree. And we may be seeing that a little bit today.
So I want to talk a little bit about 1994 election, because it was kind of a seismic shock to the system that we had come to know, right? That it really broke to some degree the Democrats' dominance in DC.
Yeah.
And so not only that, did the House go Republican, but the leadership was under Gingrich, who was a whole new style of politics, right? He was a real bomb thrower.
Right.
Politics as warfare, really. And I wonder if, I don't know that we can really do this, but in retrospect, if Clinton was really boxed in such a way that he probably, could we make an argument that he could not have advanced progressive causes after 1994, and that what he was doing instead was just trying to find a way to be somewhat successful?
Oh, yes. Well, unquestionably, after the elections of 94, I mean, Clinton famously triangulates and tries to reach various kinds of accommodations with the Gingrich Republicans. I mean, he's actually, as a kind of clever politician, he actually does that in some clever ways. He does do that. He does cut his losses, as it were. But unquestionably, he's on the defensive. His ambitions are curbed dramatically, and of course he does move to the right. He pushes the welfare reform bill, which was adamantly opposed by many in his cabinet and in the Democratic Party. I mean, really, his closest people, some of them were opposed to it. He pushes that in the most cynical way, thinking that he, this is the only way he can get reelected in 1996. That probably wasn't true, but he does that in any event. I want to just say one thing about Newt Gingrich. Yes, he's called a bomb thrower, and he's rhetorically a kind of ultra kind of figure. But one thing he does, and Bill Kristol today is a bit of a never Trumper, and it's sort of, I guess, drifted a bit to the left. But in those days, there's a big fight inside the Republican Party. The Dole wing, the Robert Dole wing, Dole will run for president as Republican in 1996. Dole thinks we can make some compromises with Clinton, especially on health care. We can, and we'll come up with some system, some program which is, amenable to the insurance companies, and but it'll be better. Gingrich and Bill Kristol say absolutely not. And you have this remarkable situation in 1993 and 4, in which the right wing of the Republican Party is lobbying business, not the other way around. The Republicans are lobbying business and business associations to not cooperate with Clinton and Ira Magaziner, who is the head of the healthcare task force, not to cooperate with them in constructing some sort of a healthcare plan. And they just say, no, nothing. We don't want anything. No compromise. Nothing. And when they win on that, the healthcare, which was the major initiative, domestic initiative of the Clinton people, it goes down to defeat. And along with NAFTA, that I think sets the stage for the 1994 Republican victories in Congress. And then from that point on, again, the Clinton is dickering around with Gingrich on various questions that move him to the right in general.
This also is an aside, but as long as you bring him up, and this might be more of an observation than a question, but I think it's fascinating that figures like Bill Kristol and maybe Charlie Sykes as well, they were not just conservative figures. They were really in the Republican trenches in the 90s
Yeah.
and early 2000s up until they became never Trumpers. And what I find fascinating about that is that when they became never Trumpers, both of them, along with a handful of other pretty right wing figures, they also became a bit leftist in their policies. And I'm not sure what happened there.
No, that's an observation I made too, and I'm not entirely understanding what that represents. Clearly, one thing it represents is that I think that they were neoconservatives in general in foreign policy questions. They'd been big champions of the Iraq War, and Trump clearly is not part of that. But you're right, and we don't entirely understand it. The other thing I would say, it indicates that they were chiefs without Indians. They were leaders. I thought, well, if all these sort of famous Republicans are against Trump, surely they represent 1 or 2 or 5% of the Republican base, but apparently not at all. Mm-hmm. So they seemingly have had no influence either in 2016 or 2024. But you're right, they have moved a bit to the left, and that's a phenomenon I don't think we entirely understand, because I guess Liz Cheney, if you actually would probe her, she would say, "Yeah, I'm still a right-wing Republican on all sorts of questions." But I mean, that seems to be of much less importance than her opposition to Trump on constitutional grounds. Mm-hmm. So
Adam Kinzinger too.
Yeah, all of them. All of them. Actually, Liz Cheney, I think she made a point when she was fighting the Republicans, she was still in Congress, of voting down the line for the most conservative position. She wanted to make it clear that I'm still conservative Republican, even though I think Trump is illegitimate. But that had no impact. That had no one cared.
Your most recent book, A Fabulous Failure, about the Clinton presidency, we could chalk it up to a title, right? But clearly, you do see the Clinton presidency through this lens. And so I guess I wonder, in retrospect, and knowing what we know now, and if we take the title at face value, how should we be evaluating the Clinton presidency overall?
Yeah, well, I say fabulous is sort of, well, the reason the word fabulous is there is because Janet Yellen and another prominent economist, Alan Blinder, wrote a small book in the year 2000, in which they said it was a fabulous decade, and and lots of indexes of economic performance say that's right: low unemployment, a booming stock market, a rising GNP, a balanced budget. So yes, there was but all of this was kind of built on sand. All of this didn't have really firm grounding, and it would be either evaporate or be destroyed, in subsequent years. And the fact that Al Gore he wins the popular vote, but loses in the year 2000. He should have peace and prosperity. He should have won in a landslide. And there are reasons for that. I think that Clinton set the stage for that. It wasn't just Monica Lewinsky, by the way. It was that Al Gore could not put forward a bold program, because the balanced budget that Clinton did create at the end of his administration was a kind of albatross. He was so afraid that the Republicans would just create a series of tax breaks, which George W. Bush would do when he gets in. But Clinton was so afraid of that. They said, well, we're gonna put this balanced budget, we're gonna devote it entirely to sustaining Social Security. Mm-hmm. And Al Gore would say, we're putting the budget surplus in a lockbox. Well, what the hell is that? Who cares about that? That Gore was could not make any bold plans, any attractive plans in running for president in the year 2000. And so, it was much closer than it should have been. And he lost. So Clinton kind of creates a prison of his own design by the end of the 1990s, and which kind of stymies him in any effort to use that remarkable balanced budget to help his constituents, to help his base, to help his the people who voted for him.
One of the narratives about this past election is that Democrats are lost in the wilderness and have completely lost touch with their base. And there's probably a nugget of truth to that, but that's notwithstanding the fact that the popular vote was very close. The Democrats lost or gained a seat in the House. And, the Senate was really probably because of malapportionment. It wasn't like a wipeout, right? But it is true that the labor vote and the working class vote has definitely shifted towards the Republican Party and away from the Democratic Party. And in that sense, the Democratic Party does have some soul searching to do, right? And they do have to reconstitute themselves and try to put together some type of a coalition. And if they want that coalition to be progressive, I guess my question for you is, if they were to just examine the trajectory of the vote away from them since the Clinton era, what could they learn from Clinton's presidency in reconstituting themselves now?
Well, as I said, one has to provide benefits and ideological and material for one's base, for the base. I think Biden tried to do that, but imperfectly. By the way, I would just make this point that the working class vote in general, the 90% of the working class who are not in unions, and this includes brown and black people as well, did well. It did more. Mainly, it stayed home. Mainly, it voted for the couch more than for Trump, and that's the demobilization of the base. The actual number in unions, the 10% of the electorate in unions actually maintain their support for the Democrats pretty much, and partly that was just the get out the vote efforts of the unions. But that was, of course, that wasn't enough to be decisive. But I think the lesson we learned from Clinton for contemporary Democrats is that the key to winning elections is the mobilization of one's base. That is the key. And don't try to reach out to some mythical or a center, because actually, in fact, most people are polarized. Harris made a big mistake in butting around with Cheney, not because Cheney was a bad person, but because she didn't represent anybody. Liz Cheney didn't really represent. There was no substance to her constituency. But anyway, to mobilize the base, I think Bernie Sanders understood that. I think Biden understood it, but was unable to do it. And I think that's the lesson we should learn. And Clinton didn't do that. That's why he was a terrible party manager, and he demobilized, his people who should have been in favor of him. So that would be the lesson I would learn.
Do you see in the Democratic Party right now any potential leaders that could, I suppose, move the Democratic Party out of the wilderness and back into some fighting position that is specific to a progressive movement, not just winning?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Who's to say who will emerge? I don't want to play this personality game. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people. I do think that I think that the basis of a progressive movement would be opposition to Trumpism. I mean, just don't make these accommodations, and you can sort of see this happening. We're an opposition party, and here's what we think. Make that clear continuously. And the Republicans certainly do that. The Democrats should do that as well. And secondly, I do think that the alliance with the labor movement, the one thing what the labor movement can do, whether it's wins higher wages or not, it creates a kind of world, cultural and organizational and political, in which ordinary people feel that they have a certain agency, a certain power, a certain collective strength. And I think that's a prophylactic against the kind of atomized populism to which Trump appeals. And I think that there's a reason that Sean Fain has emerged as kind of a national figure. I mean, and because he represents that. It's not to say that all UAW members are voting for Democrats or anti-Trump. They aren't. Actually, in the Deep South. I did some reportage, and they're split half and half. But nevertheless, there's a kind of the origins of a dynamic movement there, and I think that I think the Democrats have and will align themselves with that. That's one part of the ingredient. But it's a big fight because the whole sort of American political terrain, cultural terrain has been tilted to the right, and Trump is trying to consolidate that right now, and and that's a big fight.
Mm.
Actually, let me make let me just make one historical vignette from the Clinton period, which may explain some of this. During the Monica Lewinsky, just before the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which really took Clinton sort of out of operation during the year 1998, Clinton was dickering around with Gingrich about privatizing Social Security. Now, he wasn't going to do the whole thing, but they were beginning to nibble around doing that. And this was again part of this movement to the right. Well, the Lewinsky scandal erupts, and so who are the staunch supporters of Bill Clinton in the midst of this scandal? Well, it's not the moderate Democrats, and of course not the Republicans. It's the left wing of the Democratic Party. It's Barney Frank, who knew something about sex and knew something about finance, and people like that. And so Clinton, right in the middle of this scandal, says, "Well, I guess I better stop dickering around with Newt Gingrich on privatizing Social Security, because my staunch, if I want to stay president and avoid impeachment, I have to sustain Social Security along with these left wingers." So the meme that came out is that Monica Lewinsky saved Social Security. I mean, and there's I think an element of truth to that. So that indicates the importance of cultivating one's base. I think that is something that the Democrats have to do.
All right, final question. You ready for it?
Yeah.
What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
Yeah, I've been reading this wonderful book by Zachary Carter. It came out 3 or 4 years ago, on John Maynard Keynes. And it's a very, very good book. And what's interesting about it, he shows the radicalism of Keynesianism. Keynes, when by the time Clinton comes along, Keynesian in America were sort of tepid, Oh, let's give a tiny little, we'll give a tax reduction for business. We'll do it. I mean, they were very tepid. But this book by Zachary Carter shows that Keynes was a real radical who really, both culturally and economically, he wanted, he both in Britain and America, he wanted to basically manage capitalism in the most vigorous way possible, so as to, he talked about the euthanasia of the rentiers, which meant the euthanasia of the Robert Rubens, really, of this world. He didn't mean that physically; he meant that economically. And I think that kind of a left Keynesianism, and I think Biden began to approach that. A link to a kind of industrial policy is the economic program that any new liberal formation should advance.
Hey, what are you working on right now?
I'm writing a book entitled "Why Unions Matter," a short book designed for the under 35 age group, in which I look at both actually interesting. I look at like the world of academia and why you've had this tremendous surge in a pro-union direction among the grad students, and not just in the humanities but also in the sciences. I look at at some kind of odd little union places and try to see what's significant about why they exist, from baristas to taxi drivers in New York to all sorts of people. And I'm trying to show why unions are essential and should be central to the revival of any liberal movement. And the last chapter is going to be looking throughout the entire 20th century at when trade unions have saved democracy, whether it's or efforts to do so, whether it's Spain or Spain, but actually before Franco and then after Franco, or South Africa, or various parts of Latin America, et cetera. So that's what I'm writing right now.
Dr. Lichtenstein, thanks for taking the time and for the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Bill Clinton's presidency reshaped the Democratic Party, but at what cost? By prioritizing political pragmatism over progressive ideals, his administration weakened the social contract, disillusioned working-class voters, and helped pave the way for right-wing populism. The failures of that era still haunt us today as we grapple with democratic backsliding and the resurgence of authoritarian politics. But understanding and accepting these failures can maybe also help us chart a path forward. Progressives can and should reclaim the fight for economic justice, push for bold policies that restore faith in government, and mobilize at the grassroots level to rebuild a democracy that truly serves the people. Organizing, voting reform, and holding leaders accountable are key steps, critical steps, in this moment toward reversing the damage and creating a change that works for everybody, while also embracing progressive values. All right, check back next week for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.